Welcome to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. My name is Teresa MacLennan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. We are really happy that you're here with us today. The goal of our program is to talk about issues and situations and life experiences of women. We will be talking about issues of violence against women, gender equity, women in leadership and decision-making, opportunities for women. So we're really glad and welcome our viewers today. Thank you for coming along this journey with us. And we try to create an environment that is open, non-judgmental, where we can just dive in and have some really great learning opportunities. Before we begin and have a conversation with our wonderful guest today, we also want to thank and recognize our Indigenous community and partners for allowing us to share in this space. We thank you so much for your partnership and creating this land and this beautiful space for us to have these conversations. So without further ado, I want to welcome my guest, Ashley. And Ashley is from the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. And Ashley, would you like to introduce yourself and just let our viewers know what role it is that you have here at the shelter?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Teresa. So my name is Ashley Jeneraul, pronouns she, her, and I am the lead facilitator of the Violence Prevention Program, which is a initiative funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation that supports youth 12 to 18 in the Barrie and surrounding areas, that works to teach about healthy relationship dynamics and violence.
So would you say that that is the main goal of the program is to, how do you do that? Do you reach out to youth? What does that look like?
Yeah, so as a program, we aim to shift the ingrained systemic attitudes that perpetuate violence and discrimination in our community. And to do this, the team works to foster youth's critical thinking abilities by providing education and facilitating conversation around the different aspects of healthy relationship development. So ultimately, our goals for the program are to support youth in making positive lifestyle choices, and empower them to create a healthier, safer society for everyone, free of violence and abuse.
So what would you say is the importance, Ashley, in being able to speak with youth and talking to them those younger ages?
So I would say that it comes from the ability to educate from a young age. Often habits and behaviors that form happen in our adolescent years. And so if we're able to teach younger audiences about what a healthy relationship looks like and signs of abusive behavior that's occurring within relationships, we have a better chance of putting an end to violence against women and gender-based violence overall.
And I really love what you've said there. And I just want to emphasize that for our viewers, because we do have, of course, women and their children who come into our shelter. And we know that children in particular who have witnessed or lived in violence, there is a higher relationship between that experience and experiencing violence themselves as older adults, or also the potential to become the perpetuator of abuse as well. And so I can absolutely see the importance of talking to young people and trying to change that thinking and behaviors for the better for their future as they become adults. So thank you for that explanation, because I think that's really, really key and so important to talk to youth. So it is such a big topic, and there's so much that we're really looking forward to talking to you about. But I want to start to dive in today to talk about consent, because I think there can be some misinterpretation of what consent means between relationships of people. So can you, where we want to start, can you offer us an explanation of consent that, I think our viewers could easily understand? How do we define what is consent?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So consent is a voluntary agreement to do something. And specifically when it comes to sex, it involves communication and an enthusiastic agreement between all people involved in the encounter. And this is at every single point of interaction. So this needs to be done through both verbal acknowledgement as well as physical body language of the person that you're engaging with. And ultimately, gaining consent is about respecting people's boundaries and ensuring we're never making assumptions about another person's choices within a sexual relationship.
And so we're going to dive into that much, much more for sure, because it is very important. And there can be a perception of consent that actually doesn't exist. And so why is consent extremely and vitally important and necessary? Why?
Yeah, so to put it simply, in the absence of consent, sexual violence is occurring. And this is why we believe as a violence prevention program, it's so important to educate youth and the community about this issue. It's important that we begin to make consent a common practice within every relationship that we hold. Unfortunately, statistics show us that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 8 men will experience sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. And just as problematic of a statistic is that in a survey conducted by the Canadian Women's Foundation, 28% of Canadians reported that they don't actually fully understand what consent means. Mm-hmm. So these findings highlight that there's a dire need in our country, in our communities, to educate on what constitutes having gained consent in a sexual relationship.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that is really helpful, and we do need to always be talking about the importance of consent and what that looks like. And I just want to tag on to the statistics that you shared, because certainly 1 in 3 women, 1 in 8 men. And I also want to highlight that for our Indigenous community, in particular our Indigenous women and young girls, the incidence of violence and sexual violence is also so much greater than even the non-Indigenous community. And so that's why these conversations are so vitally important. And so let's unpack it. Let's unpack it a little bit more. So for our viewers, in a really tangible way, can you offer examples of situations where consent may be perceived as being given, but actually has not been given?
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly when working with youth, one that we hear come up often is when people perceive they've received consent when alcohol and or drugs are involved in the encounter. So as we've talked about, consent is a voluntary agreement to do something, and alcohol and drugs have the power to impact our judgment, affect our behavior, and impair our decision-making ability. So substance use of any kind makes us more vulnerable to potentially harmful and dangerous situations, which is particularly true when it comes to sex. So for these reasons, this is why consent can't be given when we are under the influence of any substances.
So I want to just put a pin there and just ask you, so if you are involved with someone in a relationship or an encounter, and drugs or alcohol are involved, and the person may be saying yes, the person may be saying no, do we start from a place that consent cannot be given because we cannot trust the yes or the no because drugs or alcohol are involved?
Yeah, I would say that should be the rule, in that it helps to protect both parties involved, right? We never want to assume that somebody has consented when they are in a state that, when their mind's being altered. And also it helps to protect the person who is seeking out the consent to know for certain that they are not overstepping a choice that somebody's trying to make. So always sort of choosing not to engage in sexual activity during a time that you're drinking or under the influence of other drugs would be something that I would highly recommend, especially for youth that are learning.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's a really good point. And we can imagine the difficulties for youth or anyone who drinking may be involved in your encounter with someone. And someone may be saying, yes, I'm willing, and I'm saying yes, right? But there really does need to be a step back and thinking about that situation and safety for that person and also for the other person who is involved. We certainly do see situations where, because we are an agency that supports women experiencing violence, we have women tell us the story that I was violated. I experienced a sexual assault, but I was drinking at the time. And I may have said yes, I may have said no. And there's an incredible amount of guilt that women can carry in that interaction that they've had, because they may have said yes and they may have said no, right? And if everyone understood that voluntary consent cannot be assumed when drugs and alcohol are involved, we would really make great gains for women and men not to be in those situations where the consent has been questioned. That if we always assume consent has not been given, if in any way the person is impaired, would that ever make a difference? Would you agree?
Absolutely, 100%. And I would say another big one that comes up a lot of the time is when people consent under some kind of pressure or force. And this is what we would call sexual coercion, and is a form of sexual violence. Because in the absence of the voluntary pieces and the enthusiasm behind agreement to engage in any kind of sexual activity, consent hasn't been granted. So coercion, what coercion is any of repeated attempts to engage in sex after a person has said no, and can often occur in statements that make a person feel shame or guilt if they choose not to. So in sort of pressuring somebody into saying yes, you may feel like you've gained consent, but actually, in fact, all you are doing is perpetuating sexual violence in those moments.
So I love the points that you are sharing with us and our viewers. So we're going to put a pin right there, and we're going to circle back to this conversation, because again, it is so important for our viewers, our community, to have this great understanding about consent and what that looks like and what consent does not look like. And so we ask our viewers, please stay with us and continue along with us in this great conversation. It is a wonderful education piece for ourselves in how we support youth to understand consent, and for our community, and of course, the women that we support who have an experience of violence. Please stay with us. We'll be back with you in just a minute. Welcome back to Educate, Inform, Challenge. Again, I'm Teresa MacLennan from the Women and Children Shelter, and we're welcoming our guest, Ashley, from the Violence Prevention Program. So we're having some really great deep dives today, talking about the importance of educating youth in particular about healthy relationships. And today we are talking in depth about consent and what consent looks like. We know that there is a vital piece in educating our youth so that they understand what does consent really look like. And Ashley has shared some wonderful, tangible examples of what consent is, but also what consent is not. And so we want to pick up in our conversation, Ashley, because we were talking about, sexual coercion. Can you just remind us again, what is sexual coercion in terms of consent?
Yeah, so sexual coercion is using pressure, force, or manipulation to engage in any kind of sexual activity. So it involves repeated attempts to engage in sex as well. So when somebody's continually asking you and making you feel guilt or shame if you opt to not. And it's unfortunately, a common experience that many women and people in general in our society experience.
So, you've really kind of made me think about something which I think could be really interesting for us to chat a little bit about. What does consent look like in terms of two people who are in a committed relationship with each other. Does consent apply to that sort of a relationship? And how does that look?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that sometimes people do believe that when you've committed yourself to somebody in a relationship, in a marriage, that the rules around consent change and that there's some kind of obligation that is meant to be upheld. And this isn't true. To put it blatantly, no matter kind of what your situation is when it comes to a relationship, when you're engaging in sex of any kind, consent is a requirement in order to ensure that sexual violence isn't occurring. So, being married to somebody, even for a lifetime, doesn't give them permission to engage in any kind of activity or encounter with you. And same for youth that are committed in a dating relationship. You still need those essential pieces and conversations to be had between you and your partner. And that is that you are gaining permission to engage in sex voluntarily, and that you're also doing that without any kind of pressure or force. And that it's enthusiastic, that both parties involved are interested in the encounter that's about to happen.
So really the same rules apply no matter who, so no matter who you are, and the nature of the interaction or relationship that you're having with someone, the same consent rules apply. Mm-hmm. And I do really appreciate that clarity, because when I tie that into the work that we do here in the shelter, and we support women who've experienced violence and their children, women will tell us that, for a considerable amount of time, they've remained in a relationship where they have been abused. And part of that abuse has been feeling forced to engage in sexual acts with their partner when they have not wanted to. And it is part of that violence that women have experienced. Would you say that isn't a good example, at least for our viewers to understand, that women who experience violence have been in those committed relationships and have felt forced to perform those acts when they have not wanted to?
Yeah, unfortunately, these situations happen often. And they often could catch you off guard, right? In one instance, it might feel okay for you to have allowed for the encounter to have sort of happened the way that it did, but then in another, it might not feel as good. And truly it is about knowing what in your gut feels right, and being able to have choice in the ways that you use your body and engage with others sexually.
And I think also it's important just to say consent can be withdrawn at any time. Mm-hmm. And do you want to speak about that?
Well, I was just going to say, so there's a tool that we use within our program to help people truly understand, specifically youth, kind of what all the components of consent are. So we use this acronym that we've adapted from Planned Parenthood in the States, and it is the acronym FRIES. So consent must always be freely given, so voluntary, and it has to have the ability to be withdrawn or reversible, which is the R, at any time. It needs to be informed. So people need to know what the activity that they're consenting to involves and what it entails before consent can truly be achieved. The person offering the consent, as we've talked about, needs to be doing so enthusiastically, and consent has to be given for each specific activity being engaged in at that specific point in time. So that is the acronym that we try to use to help youth truly grasp what are the pieces of consent that are needed.
And I think it's a great acronym, because I think that probably a lot of youth will remember fries.
Absolutely.
Very
it's
important.
Kind of a fun thing and checklist to go through whenever you're in that situation, right?
And I think it is a great tool as well. And we're going to talk a little bit later on, but a great tool for parents to be thinking about that acronym as well. And what I think I hear you really saying is that, you know, whatever folks are going to be engaging in, is that there is conversation that's happening throughout that entire engagement or interaction. Because again, like you said, consent can be pulled back at any time. And knowing exactly what it is that you're consenting to is so vitally important, right? And I think we can all agree that in relationships, and let's say we're in an interaction with someone and it's a sexual interaction, things can morph and things can roll along. And then things can be something that maybe someone does not feel comfortable with. They can happen organically and naturally, but we do have to have that understanding that there may be some things that folks are not comfortable doing, that they don't want to engage in. And the importance of having those conversations throughout and dialogue, healthy, honest dialogue, is so crucial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I also just wanted to ask you, age of consent. Can you talk to us about that? Because, you know, we haven't even mentioned that yet, but that is a key component to consent of any kind. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so age of consent in Canada is 16, but there are some sort of limitations to that, as well as exceptions to that as well. And I don't have all of that information sitting in front of me, so I don't want to go too much into detail, but I think ultimately when we talk again about age of consent, something important to recognize and to acknowledge is that no matter your age, as a youth, you can't consent to anyone that is in a position of authority or power over you. So we do hear in the news quite often, unfortunately, about these situations occurring where a teacher or a coach or even somebody maybe that's 10 years older than, you know, a 17-year-old that is looking to engage or has engaged in some kind of sexual encounter. And this is not okay. It's really important that we do learn the laws that exist and the reasons they're there to safeguard our youth. And it's really important that parents have those conversations with their children in an effort to inform them sort of what that looks like. Because there are instances where they might feel like, yeah, I did consent to whatever activity has occurred. But in reality, just based on the nature of the relationship that's happening, it wasn't possible for them to do so.
And that very much ties into, of course, the work that we do here in the shelter. And we have an understanding of violence of all kinds is based on power and control. Mm-hmm. And from power and control, there can be a perceived sense of authority, right? Yeah. So we are, our time has gone very, very quickly today. So, we've got a few minutes left. Where do parents start in having a conversation with their child about consent?
Honestly, I believe that very strongly from a violence prevention perspective that it needs to start from a very young age. And it's easy to do so in ways that are age appropriate and for children to developmentally be able to process. So what I mean when I say that is thinking about how, allowing young children the bodily autonomy to let their parents and the adults in their life know what they're interested in when it comes to touch and what they're not. I also think really important to encourage children to ask permission prior to seeking out a hug or a kiss, anything of that nature, because it helps to build those values for them from the youngest of ages that gets carried through youth into adolescence and beyond. And I know that, for many families that this might not have been their way of educating their children, right? Consent is a topic that's really come into conversation in recent years. And so For you, I think what would be important in educating your teens would be to just become comfortable with talking about it yourself. We need to help our teenagers to feel like that we are safe people to come to have these conversations, and that we're not going to judge them when doing so. It's perfectly appropriate if ever you're having any kind of concerns about behavior, to be honest with them about that and to facilitate that dialogue, but it needs to come from a place of non-judgment, and that allows for them to feel they're able to be open and honest with you about what's happening for them.
And you know what, I think that those were great, tangible guidance for parents and anyone listening today. And I love the point that you said, talking about consent happens at a very early age, and it does not need or require a conversation about sexual relationships. Talking to your child about asking permission to hug, to kiss, are all elements of consent that are building blocks to those further conversations that they will have down the road. So I love that. And that's really a helpful tool for anyone listening today. So we've got about 1 minute left. If folks want to know more about the violence prevention program, if teachers are interested, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can feel free to email our program or give us a call. You can also check out our website, and we also have an Instagram page that you could connect with if you're on that platform. This is all of the areas that we post information about any virtual sessions we have coming up, and different things we're involved with in the community.
Super. So we will have all that information for our viewers. And Ashley, I want to thank you again so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, great. And you know, we'd love to have you back again. So we also just want to thank our viewers for being with us today. Really great topics, lots to think about. We really hope that this has provided you some guidance as you go out and talk to our youth and support them. Thank you for being with us. Take care, and we'll see you soon.